Okay, so welcome everyone to the fourth Popularizing Paleontology workshop. This one is on debates and issues, so following on from three others that we've been doing previously. Now, just so I can tell the story so far for people who might not have been here before or who might need their minds refreshing, this is basically a series of workshops that I've been setting up for the past 2 years now, which has been attempting to get together paleontologists, science communicators, humanities and social science academics, artists and various people involved with museums to really try to get to grips with the issue of why paleontology is and has been such an important and such a widespread and such a sort of deeply rooted science within public discourse, popular discourse, for really since the inception of the field 200 years ago. And the kind of rationale for this is I kind of approached this area from my background as a historian of science, where I was sort of very much aware that within the history of science itself, this had been a very, very big field where lots of people were working on, using paleontology as a test case for thinking about the role of science in public life, and a science which has had a major impact on the way in which people think about evolution, development, and a whole range of fields. But then as I was sort of looking around, then I saw that within paleontology itself, within museums, and within various forms of science communication, people were doing very, very similar things, thinking about very similar sorts of issues in a very reflexive kind of way, but not really talking very often across these different boundaries and across these different disciplines. So that's really the kind of purpose, and so really getting together people with common interests but coming from a variety of different fields and areas. So we had our first workshop all the way back in September 2016 as a kind of general exploratory event, which went much better than I initially expected. Quite often when you try to arrange an interdisciplinary event, then people do just cluster off into their own disciplinary configurations, talk to each other, have a kind of awkward chat, not being able to come up with a common language, and then disperse. But luckily, this didn't work that way at all, and I did find that people were talking from all different perspectives, from all different fields, and actually, yeah, very much fulfilling the agenda of sort of coming up with common ideas, common discussion points, but from a variety of different perspectives. Following that, we had a second workshop, again in London at KCL, this time last year. And rather than be a kind of general exploratory thing covering a variety of different topics, this was focused on the big theme of agendas. So thinking about what is the kind of purpose of presenting paleontology within the public arena, what have been the kind of motives and agendas sort of driving this. And also what sort of audiences have been involved in this. So, so who has this kind of thing been directed towards, and who has this been sort of presented to? So those are the first two workshops. Then almost immediately after that, the last London workshop, I found out I've been awarded a grant from the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council to carry on this sort of project with a series of 4 more workshops, 2 of which will be in London, of which this is the first, and 2 of which will be international. So we had one in Amsterdam in last May, which was sort of very interesting, very successful, where we were in the kind of grand surroundings of Artists Zoo Library, with sort of Linnaeus, well, the young Linnaeus sort of overseeing proceedings, and yeah, and so discussing the kind of the same issues there, but with a kind of a slightly different group of people. And then we'll have 3 more workshops, so 2 more in London and 1 in Raleigh in North Carolina in the spring of next year. So each of these workshops is kind of following a separate main theme and a separate sort of main series of issues. So the Amsterdam one was based around kind of representations, so the types of imagery which is associated with paleontology. Today and tomorrow is about debates and issues, so thinking about large areas of cultural and ideological concern that paleontology gets connected with. Then we have a workshop on objects, so thinking about things and how particular specimens, how particular institutions, and how particular sort of taxa get interpreted within these areas. And then for the final workshop in September 2019, we'll be thinking about media, so the kind of forms and genres and different sort of modes of presenting paleontology and how it fits in with various larger forms of public communication. So our sort of set of issues for the next 2 days are really, well, relatively broad, and following this sort of broad kind of set of themes of debates and issues. And this is really following on a bit from the agendas workshop that we did a few months ago, where one of the kind of questions and one of the agendas that we came up with for why paleontology is discussed is because a lot of the time it fits in and connects with broad issues of cultural, political, or ideological concern. And so what we're thinking about over the next 2 days is what some of these have been and how they've worked through both the history of the discipline and how they potentially work with today. So a few of them that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently through my own work, which I'm going to run through quickly, but by far from the only ones, are things like ideas of development and evolution, so thinking about how the natural world has changed and what implications that has for broader ideas of development within the natural world, ideas of progress, monstrosity, and decline, which is obviously something that scientists nowadays are trying to get very, very far away from, but have been a very, very sort of powerful set of tropes and motifs in the history of the discipline, and also still in public presentations of the discipline. And more broadly, things like understanding nature, animals, and humans, and issues about conservation, extinction, diversity, and climate. So these larger issues that we've sort of been thinking about. So to kind of quickly go over some of these and my sort of thoughts on some of them is if we think about the kind of initial configuration and the initial promotion of paleontology and sort of and geology really from the 18th century through the 19th and into the 20th century, then probably one of the biggest implications that paleontology has had within both public and scientific discourse is the idea that the Earth has had a very long, a very deep history, seen a great deal of change, and seen a great deal of development across that, and really sort of historicizing both the natural world and the world that we see around us. And this is something which historians of science have looked at a great deal over the past few years. So there's a very good book recently published by Martin Rudwick on the Earth's deep history, and making the argument that this sort of promotion of these ideas by paleontology and by geology from the early 19th century onwards is a conceptual leap and a conceptual disruption as big as things like Darwinian evolution in the middle of the 19th century, and obviously associated with it, but not necessarily directly always linked. So this has been a really, really important sort of trope and motif within these wider debates and issues within paleontology. But then, of course, in the way in which paleontology has been presented in the 19th and early 20th century in scientific terms, but still often in sort of more public terms, is the kind of idea of progress, that life doesn't just change, but it changes with a particular direction and changes with a particular purpose in mind. And so if we look at these kind of classic sort of orthogenetic displays from the early 20th century American Museum of Natural History, we can see this being presented very, very strongly. So we have the horse developing as this kind of perfecting organism from the Eocene all the way up until the present, becoming this more efficient, this more kind of dynamic, and this higher sort of animal. But then on the other hand, we have the kind of alternative sort of almost the evil twin of the horse on the right. We have the Titanotheres, which is presented as developing also on its own track, but becoming steadily more monstrous, steadily more grotesque, and kind of asserting all of its evolutionary energies into its increasingly developing horns, neglecting its teeth, which are the important bit of the organism, and so invariably starving to death when the climate changes in the Oligocene. So we have these sorts of ideas which are presented very, very strongly in the early 20th century, and while sort of scientists are obviously moving away and sort of heavily rejecting the idea that the development of life is about sort of progress and improvement, in terms of kind of popular and even kind of science communication ways of presenting paleontology and the narrative of life on Earth, you still very often get these very strong progressivist narratives which are almost impossible to get away from. So this is from the University of Calgary, part of their otherwise quite good sort of outline of sort of paleontology and geological history, and you can see it sort of improving, moving through the same kind of ages of invertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and then humans that you might even expect from a kind of mid-19th century presentation. So that's sort of one big important area which often comes up in these presentations of paleontology. The other one, which is obviously very important if we're thinking about the more sensationalist side of public discussion of paleontological finds, is the idea that the past eras of Earth's history which are presented by paleontology are basically inhabited by monsters, by these strange, grotesque, aggressive, fighting sorts of animals like these sorts of marine reptiles, and pterosaurs, which are being presented in Thomas Thomas Hawkins's The Book of Great Sea Dragons from 1840, with this very sort of long-standing set of motifs. And this sort of thing carries on all the way through, really, the development of the field and disciplines. And even if we look at the way in which quite high-profile stories, television series, and so on are presented today, we still have this idea of monsters and monstrosity exists, and strangeness existing in different periods, whether we're thinking about the kind of prequel to Life Before the Dead, to kind of Walking with Dinosaurs, which is literally called Walking with Monsters, or this kind of poor anomalacrid, which is being reported on in 2018 as yet claw-faced sea monster born to kill. So, yeah, so this is still very, very much within the sort of public presentation of the discipline. And why this is something which I think is very culturally, very sort of, yeah, ideologically interesting. A kind of related thing, which is something I'm particularly interested in, is also sort of not just paleontological specimens being presented in terms of kind of just generic monsters, but in terms of sort of mythological or folkloristic tropes. So, for example, there are very frequently descriptions of both Mesozoic animals and like pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and so on as dragons. This is a very, very common trope, not just in the 19th century, but carrying up all into the present. But also a sort of interpretation which comes up even in sort of current interpretations and current discussions, such as in the work of Adrian Myers, that certain folkloristic or mythological beliefs are drawing directly from fossil discoveries and fossil specimens. And while I'm not particularly convinced by a lot of Adrian Myers' sort of presentations, this is a very definite link between this sort of idea that paleontology, in certain respects, makes a lot of myth and a lot of folklore sort of real and sort of established. Beyond that, we've also got the idea that, and this sort of area, that a lot of sort of the kind of cultural use of paleontology feeds into understandings of modern animals, and this can work in a variety of different ways. So potentially the idea that in order to understand modern organisms, modern animals, you need to understand their evolutionary history. This is a very sort of widely presented idea. But then you also have this concept that there can be a sort of conceptual non-disjunction between sort of extinct taxa living in the past and sort of current ones, often with the idea that these creatures are either unchanged or analogous to prehistoric animals, and quite frequently being tied with either ideas that this means that they're ancient organisms that we need to protect and save, or if we're looking further back in the past, that these are the kind of modern organisms are sort of evolutionary relics and are sort of doomed to disappear. So we still very often have this idea of living fossils, which is now obviously highly criticized, but almost impossible to get away from in a lot of public discourse. Or from the kind of 19th century here, we got this, this kind of elaboration of mammals, which is supposed to be from the Eocene of North America, but you can see that at least 3 of them are very, very heavily modeled on contemporary animals. So we have this early primate, which is being depicted as a sort of bush baby, a sort of early ungulate, which is sort of part tapir, half muntjac, and then this creodont, which is almost, I think that's very, very clearly modeled on a thylacine. So you've got this sort of idea that you can sort of make these very, very clear analogies between extinct and sort of modern creatures. As well as that, obviously a lot of the cultural interpretations are very, very human-centered, and particularly in the public debates, then understanding humans within evolutionary terms derived from particular forms of paleontological narrative has been a very common and a very frequent use of paleontology, working in a number of ways. So on your left, in a very, very progressivist and quite sort of problematic racialized depiction from William King Gregory's Our Fish from Race to Man, you can see the sort of human face developing through the evolutionary tree of life, moving through right at the end, the sort of chimpanzee, sort of a caricatured Australian Aboriginal, and then you have a kind of ancient Greek statue being the final sort of realization of humanity. And yeah, and these sorts of kind of models are very, very frequent if you look at kind of these depictions from the First World War. Or less problematically, you have this still being used as a tool of sort of science communication through, yeah, work through books and television programs like Neil Shubin's You're in a Fish, which is attempting to sort of present human anatomy in a kind of evolutionary way by tracing back various different elements of the human body through analogues with the evolutionary past. Beyond that, though, we've also got this issue of using paleontology to understand humans in terms of their kind of capacities and in terms of their potential linkages, but also distance from the natural world. So we have very often this idea that humans are existing on a different plane to the other animals, and that we can see the origin of these sort of human special capacities through looking at, well, particularly the sort of end Pleistocene and sort of mid-Paleolithic extinctions of large megafauna, whether we're looking at sort of these depictions from the 1900s of these kind of hunter artists with their mammoth tusks, or potentially if we're looking at this new sort of discovery of kind of humans fighting with this ground sloth and leading to the decline and extinction of the megafauna. As well as that, paleontology has often been used in order to understand wider issues around climate, nature, and the environment. And this is, again, a major thing that goes right back to the latter part of the 19th century, where a lot of the initial drivers were things like conservation and sort of early developments like that very often do have quite a strong paleontological impetus. So here we can see sort of Theodore Roosevelt, who's reflecting on one of his sort of hunting expeditions in Africa, and he's arguing how the fierce wildlife of parts of Africa today has nothing in common with what we now see in Europe and the Americas, yet in its general aspects and many of its most striking details, it reproduces the life that once was in Europe and in both the Americas in what paleontologists call the Pleistocene age. So this idea that other parts of the world potentially mirror and potentially recapitulate sort of prior geological and prior sort of periods within life's history. And on the one hand, this is sort of feeding into ideas that these parts of the world need to be preserved in order to sort of maintain kind of ecosystems and areas of biodiversity that may have been lost. But then on the other hand, of course, this is marking out Africa as a kind of primitive, unevolved and sort of wild area. And as well as that, you do see this continuing today in that if you look at sort of, debates over extinction, conservation, rewilding in particular, very often these are sort of drawing on paleontology, drawing on kind of paleontological narratives, and often kind of treating the sort of late Pleistocene as being a kind of baseline that needs to be kind of restored or gone back to. And within this, obviously, paleontology has a really, really important role. And finally, particularly within our current sort of set of concerns and our current sorts of issues, then in debates over both the biodiversity crisis and over climate change, then paleontology, both in terms of its sort of images, but also in terms of the kind of mechanisms and developments which paleontology is describing, is often used and is often integrated quite strongly within these debates. So you can see two elements within this of, for example, attempting to sort of say, to talk about the sort of last interglacial period, and this being a period in which hippos lived in Britain, and so this being a way of sort of discussing the means of, and the developments through which climate has recently changed. Or sort of just the other week, you had a report on a new sort of study of the mechanisms around the Permian mass extinction, and this was framed very sort of directly and very dramatically within a lot of the news reporting that this is giving us a model of what might happen if runaway climate change happens. So we have a very, very clear, a very sort of direct integration of paleontology within these big issues of current political and current sort of cultural concern. So that's our sort of agenda and our sort of some of the areas that we can talk about. And obviously there are a lot more that I haven't mentioned, so we can keep that for the talks and the discussions later.